Hey guys, how's it going? Today I want to talk about cut flower gardens. So I posed a question to you on both YouTube and Facebook asking you what your biggest questions were surrounding the topic of cut flower gardening, and you guys really came through. There were thousands of comments and questions. I read through all of them, and I did notice kind of a common theme. So what I want to do today is just grab some of those most asked questions and answer them for you. And this is by no means going to be a super detailed conversation, but I think it's a good conversation to get started. And then I think we have the opportunity later to sit down and really dive further in and maybe like do a cut flower garden course at some point. But I just want to jump right into the questions. The first one's from Heather. Any suggestions or ideas for someone who doesn't really have space for a designated cut flower garden, but wants to incorporate some cut flower varieties into their gardens? That's a really great question and probably the most popular one that I saw. And you can grow cut flower gardens in any kind of space. It can be in a container, a raised bed, in flower beds. That's how I've done it for a lot of years, up until this past year where I did it on a larger scale. And I would venture to say that it's actually the best way for a beginner to start, because then you're not worried about like cultivating a brand new area that's larger, and then you've got all of the other things that come along with that, like irrigation and weed control. If you've already got raised beds or you've already got a few containers, then you can start with those and they're much easier to manage. Of course, with any smaller area though, the variety choice is key. Because you want to choose things that are going to produce color and produce blooms for you all season long, because there are some kind of crops that are single cut, once and done. There are, like for example, I grew some sunflowers last year that provided one flower per plant, and that's it. The plant was done after that. And if you don't know that, and you don't know that you need to plant those in succession, so plant one crop and then a week or two later plant the same thing again, and a week or two later do it again, so that you can get multiple cuts, then you're kind of stuck with a hole in your landscape essentially. So you want to choose things like cosmos and zinnias that provide color for months and months and months. And that kind of leads me to my second questions, which were from Hillary and Robin. Hillary said, if you were going to make a basic small cut flower garden, what staples would you plant? And Robin said, which flowers would you recommend to get the best production in a small space? So you want to plant things that you get the most bang for your buck, that cut and come again, that you don't have to keep replanting. And I have my list written down, so I'm going to read it to you because there's quite a few that are really good. So zinnias, lots of different varieties. So sunflowers, Rudbekias, Dahlias, cosmos, Bachelor's buttons, Snapdragons, Lisianthus, pincushion flowers, China asters, Statice, sweet peas, Nigella, Larkspur, Craspedia, Marigolds, Calendula, and Gaillardia. It's a huge list. We'll put that in the description down below. But all of those plants, now in each category, you may find some exceptions, like in the sunflower category that I mentioned, but all of those have performed so well for me and have provided so many blooms and so many cuts that they are just really great. And there's a lot of different sizes involved in each one of these varieties as well. So if you're gardening in a container versus tucking it into your landscape, you may want to do a little bit of digging in terms of this specific variety, because like in the world of zinnias, you can get zinnias that get 36 inches tall, or you can get them that stay 10 inches tall. So if you have containers, you may want to choose varieties that stay a little smaller. Flower beds, you can go bigger. Next question was from Lisa. I'd be curious which varieties last the longest after being cut. And this is such good information to learn, and I think it takes some time, because even when I read about each individual flower, because there's so many, it's hard to hold all that information in. So I feel like over the years I've made so many different bouquets, and then I realized, oh yeah, that flower doesn't last very long, and I just made it the centerpiece of that bouquet. Everything else is going to look great for 2 weeks, and this one will last 5 days. Great. So it's kind of like over time you realize the things you can pair together and then expect them to last for a really long time, because not always do you want to have to fuss with your arrangements and pop that flower out to replace it with a new one. So things that have lasted for me really well, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, but zinnias, Chrysanthemums, Dianthus, Delphiniums, Peonies, Gladiolus, Freesias, Alstromeirias, Gomphrena, Strawflowers, and paper daisies. Those were just the ones I jotted down quickly off the top of my head, knowing that they do really well for me in a vase. Also, knowing the key moment to harvest your flowers for each specific variety is really important, because if you're harvesting at prime time, they're going to last the longest in your vase, as opposed to if you wait even a day and it's a little bit past its prime, it's not going to last as long. And you can usually find that information on the back of your seed packet. You can Google the variety or ask somebody at your local garden center, and they can tell you like you know, you need to harvest early in the morning. You need to harvest when the, you know, it's just in bud stage. It's not, you know, quite open yet, or whatever the case may be. And that way you'll have the most success and the longest vase life with your flowers. Roxanne said, what do you think are the must-have tools and supplies? It's actually pretty basic. It's probably tools and supplies that you already have, but Home Depot buckets are really handy, or any kind of vessel that can hold water where you can cut flowers and haul them from your garden inside and then do your arranging. Pruners, of course, I use Felco 2s and Felco 14s out there. The difference being the 14s are a little bit smaller, so they're great for a little bit finer tasks. I used a shovel, a garden fork, and a hula hoe for weeding, because we did everything by hand out there. We didn't do any spraying. We did use a tiller, so we tilled up the whole area first, which some people don't do, so that may not be something that applies to your situation. A gorilla cart is handy, because I'd put buckets in the cart and then haul, you know, I could have an easy way to haul them back and forth. And then in terms of other supplies, I used a little bit of Spoma Biotone starter fertilizer and the Land and Sea compost when I initially planted. About half the stuff out there got it, and half of it didn't, because we were so late in planting. And thankfully everything did pretty well. But yeah, those are the only 2 amendments that I used last year. Of course, you're going to need all of your irrigation supplies. Depending on how you are irrigating, I would recommend doing drip, so that you're not ruining any flowers with overhead water. We used drip tape last year, which worked phenomenally well for us. I did notice, though, because we got drip tape with emitter holes every 6 inches and emitter holes every 12 inches, and I will probably opt in the future to go only with the emitter holes every 6 inches. I feel like the coverage of water was way better, but it was great. The coverage was great. I feel like the amount of water that they put out was perfect, and you can run a lot of drip tape, like a lot of feet of drip tape versus traditional drip tubing. I think drip tubing you can go, what, 400 to 500 feet? Drip tape you can go how many feet?
1,000.
Like 1,000 or more?
Multiple thousands.
Oh, multiple thousands of feet. Yeah, so it's way more cost effective. Of course, it won't last quite as long as your, you know, thicker drip tubing, but it was easy to install, and I was really happy with it. As a first-time drip tape user, I had really good experience with that. Kelly says, definitely weed control, staking ideas, length and width of rows, how to do flowers for cutting but in already existing planting beds, fertilizers, types of soil amendments needed, etc. So I'm going to break this down one at a time, starting with weed control. So there are several different methods of weed control. The first being landscape fabric. A lot of cut flower farmers use that. They roll it out and then they torch holes. They burn holes where they want to plant their crops. I didn't want to do it that way because aesthetically I don't like the way it looks, but it does suppress weeds and it's kind of clean and it's quick to do. You can do it by hand, which is what we opted to do. We use a hula hoe or we pull them by hand. And I find that if you stay on it in the earlier months, so late spring, early summer, by the mid part of summer, you've really got on top of it and they kind of lull out. I mean, you're still going to have some weeds, but it's not near the amount of effort. And when you do it by hand, I feel like zoning it, which I've talked about in another video, is kind of essential, especially if you're doing it on a larger scale. So what we did is we broke our garden up into 5 zones. There were 4 rectangles in our cut flower garden. Each one of them was a zone, and then the entire perimeter of the cut flower garden was a zone as well. And so each day of the week, all you have to do is tackle one zone, and so that you're not overwhelmed with like looking at the whole thing thinking this thing's so full of weeds, I'm never going to get it tackled. But if you break it down into smaller sections, it becomes more palatable and it's way easier to tackle that way. So at least, you know, once a week each zone is being looked at, and you still get your weekend. Those 2 days off. So I think I mentioned hula hoe and sometimes a winged weeder and just by a hand. You can also mulch, which I think is a really good option and one we will probably do in the future. It looks really nice. It suppresses the weeds. It breaks down and kind of enriches the soil. It is something that you have to continually do though. So it's one of those things, especially on a larger scale, in a big space, it's a little bit harder. But if you are doing cut flowers in a flower bed situation or a smaller raised bed, totally easy to put down a nice layer of mulch and keep all those weeds down. And of course you can spray for weeds, and it's not something I would actually recommend in a cut flower garden situation. There are organic sprays or natural sprays, there are synthetic sprays you can use, but even when I was planting in a larger area, everything grows so big and they grow so close together, I think it would be very easy to accidentally drift some of that spray onto something that you don't mean to hurt, and it will hurt it. So I mean, that is certainly an option. out there, but not something that I will do in our space. The next part of that question is about staking ideas, and that is a huge category. I'm going to only speak to my experience on this one because there are a lot of different types of flowers out there that want to be staked different ways. And so I'm not very good at staking my stuff up. I'm not very diligent about it, but I did stake our dahlias, and I feel like that system worked really well for us. We used 5-foot T-post stakes placed every 8 feet, pounded those into the ground, and then used a white nylon rope. I mean, it was very like a string almost, and ran those at about, I want to say 2 feet and 3 feet up, maybe 3.5 feet. Anyway, so there was 2 runs of rope between each one of those T-posts, and then the dahlias were planted right beneath that bottom rope. So as they grew, if they needed to be staked, which most of them actually didn't, I didn't stake most of them. I did plant late, so maybe they didn't get quite as big as they could have. But I would use these little rubber-coated wire twist tie looking things, and you just tie the dahlia off to the rope. And it was very simple and effective. I actually didn't stake up any of our other flowers this past year and had decent luck not doing that. The Snapdragons and the stock that I grew could have used some staking, but they did fine. I mean, they had some upright blooms, but then also some kind of leggier blooms that wanted to weigh themselves down to the ground a bit. I still cut those, and they were a very interesting shape to come out of a vase. But I think this next year I want to implement a kind of grow through grid system, and you'll see these in a lot of different cut flower farmers' fields where they do stakes, and then there's either like a nylon kind of rope mesh kind of thing where there's holes in it, or you can do a metal kind of ranch panel situation where you plant all your stuff beneath the grid system, and as they grow they'll just go right through the grid and then they're held up. I think that's a really effective system and something that I will do in the future. And then of course you have your vine crops, which there's a lot of different trellising systems that you can choose, whether you want to go really decorative and fancy if you're doing cut flower garden to be pretty rather than like purely production, or you can go the ranch panel route, which is what I did. We put up a temporary ranch panel fence around the cut flower garden, which really, it gave me borders, which I work really well within borders. And then it allowed us a space to plant some vining things, and that worked out really nice. Next is length and width of rows, and everybody has their own system for this. So I'll tell you what I did in our garden and then how I'm going to adjust it for this next year. So what we did is we had our main water line, and I would run drip tape off of it in groups of 3. So I would put a run of drip tape, which went 80 feet roughly, and then 10 inches, and then another run of drip tape, 10 inches, another run of drip tape. So there were 3 runs of drip tape in a grouping, and then I would skip 3 feet and then do my next run of drip tape so that there was a 3-foot walkway between the drip tapes. And I liked how that worked out. I feel like the water coverage was really nice, and that's something I will still do, but I think I'll make the walkways a little bit bigger, especially with the bigger crops like sunflowers. There was hardly any room to walk in there. I think I would go minimum of 5 feet in between those groupings. However, on the flip side, when you plant your stuff closer together, they kind of stake each other up. They kind of lean on each other for support. So my sunflowers did really well, given the fact that they got so big and they were exposed to all kinds of wind, and they still stayed upright for the most part because they were planted close together. It's just a real big pain to walk through there to cut specific varieties. And if you know sunflowers, they are like Velcro. They grab onto your skin and like kind of scrape you as you go by. So I'll adjust the walking rows a little bit, but the 3 runs of drip tape 10 inches apart was really nice because you can do a row of flowers on the outer sides and then the 2 runs in between, so you can have 4 rows of flowers. And when you're planting zinnias like that and you've got 4 rows, I mean, you get a ton of production in a very small space. It's very efficient. Okay, the next part of that question was how to do flowers for cutting but in already existing planting beds. I kind of talked about that already. Just choosing the right kind of varieties that will cut and come again instead of things that you need to constantly replace. Fertilizers, the Biotone starter fertilizer from Espoma and Land and Sea Compost was what I used. Types of soil amendments needed. I'm not really going to delve into that too much because everybody's situation is so different. Something that we will be adding into our space is soil acidifier. We're super high pH, so we're going to start applying soil acidifier to everything, almost as like a fertilizer. So if you know certain things about your area, if you have really low pH, then you would want to add lime. You have high pH, you want to add a soil acidifier or sulfur. So there's a lot of different things though that you can be adding. I think the most important thing is just to add in compost, add in organic material and start building your soil up. That's the #1 best thing you can do no matter what. Martha says, if you start the seeds indoors, it seems like you need a huge amount of space to store them, plus grow lights, etc. Best ways to do that without having to move out of your house or invest in a greenhouse. In that case, I would be incredibly selective about the things you start inside. Only grow the things that make you really excited, or the flowers that you love, or the ones that you know are going to provide a ton to cut from and a lot of color for your space. So just focus on those few things, and maybe like kind of eliminate the things that are just experimental or kind of random, or things that you don't love quite as much, and then err mostly on stuff that you can direct sow straight in your garden. I also have a small list written down just off the top of my head of things that have done really well for me being direct sown, and these things can be direct sown as soon as the soil warms up a little bit, usually sometime in May for us here in Eastern Oregon. And then I've sown a lot of these like midsummer, like mid to late July, and I still get a crop of flowers by the end of the season. So they're really amazing that way. So we've got Cosmos Bachelor's buttons, sunflowers, Zinnias, Amaranth, Morning Glory, Tthonia, Marigolds, Nasturtiums, Larkspur, Nigella. I'm probably missing some, but also Dahlias and Gladiolas. I mean, take into consideration a dahlia. I mean, you put a tuber in the ground. You didn't have to grow it on at any point if you didn't want to. You don't have to have any grow lights inside. You just pop the tuber in the ground, and they grow big, they grow fast, and they produce tons of flowers to cut from one single plant. So you really can fill up a space with a ton of beauty, a ton of color and texture without ever having to start anything inside if you don't want to, or you don't want to dedicate the space for it. Allison said, this will be the dumbest question, but I seriously have a hard time with it. How do you get pristine looking flowers? That's not a dumb question, because there are a lot of different factors that can play into your flowers not looking the best. Mine always have some kind of defect, dark spot, or just when picked fall apart. And I think some of that comes from knowing when to harvest your flowers, like the peak time. So a little bit of research on your part, depending on what varieties you're growing, to know when to pick them would be the best. That way they won't fall apart on you. The other things that can make your flowers look bad are insect pressure. If you've got insect issues, that's like number one. If you've got insects eating on your plant and your plant's stressed, you're going to either have holes in your flowers, or they're just not going to look the best. So having a game plan in place to take care of that sort of thing is really key. So either, companion planting, putting some things in there in your garden that act as a host plant, like Nicotiana and Calendula are great plants to put in a cut flower garden situation where you deal with aphids, because the aphids will be attracted to those plants rather than everything else. So it keeps your other plants clean without having to spray, but you can spray. There are a lot of different really good sprays out there, a lot of organic options. So there's, spinosad, that's a Captain Jack's dead bug is the name of that one. There's neem sprays, and even insecticidal soap will knock a lot of things down. So if you keep insect pressure either nil or really low, your plants will look better. If you don't want to spray at all or do companion planting, you can do floating row covers. That'll just be a little bit more of an infrastructure setup. So you have to have, specific hoops or stakes, and then you use that kind of gauzy white material, but it completely protects your crops. It allows moisture to still enter and light, but it keeps all insects off. In bigger situations, like for me, I didn't feel like that would be a really good solution unless it was a very specific crop that I needed to have look good at a specific time. If you know what I mean? Like if you're growing a type of flower for a wedding, let's say, and you need that crop to be perfect, a floating row cover is not a bad idea. And then there's some environmental things. So if you have a really intense wind, just knowing where to site your flowers to where they're not getting beat up all the time, or if you can plant some kind of a wind barrier, that is helpful. If you have any extreme temperatures at all, like we do have usually a little bit of time in the summer where we've got some extreme heat, and that can kind of wear them out a little bit. And so you can kind of expect there to be maybe some periods of time within your cut flower garden growing season where the flowers just aren't like 100% perfect. And I think that's natural, and you're going to run into that, so don't let that discourage you, because there's environmental things that we cannot control, but there are those things that we just talked about that you can. Buffalo Bill Buffalo Love said, I would like to know your thoughts on compatible plants per row. You've had some issues with watering, overwatering. Yes, I did. But like vegetables, are there plants that are better together? Yes. And for me, that is a learn by doing sort of situation. So last year I planted both paper daisies and strawflowers. I should have planted them in the same row, but I didn't, because they're very low water users. And I had them alongside, what else did I have in that row? China asters, maybe some snapdragons. And in order to keep all of my other plants happy, like the asters and the snapdragons, I had to irrigate quite a bit, and it made my Strawflowers very unhappy. So I had to make a decision, which crop am I going to let perish? And I let the Strawflowers perish because I felt like the other ones provided a little bit more of something that I wanted. So kind of going forward, I know that I need to look for keywords on my plant descriptions, like this one's a low water user or drought tolerant, and put those things in a specific spot where I can control the water a little bit better, so that I can keep the water hungry stuff together, they can get the amount of water they need, and then the stuff that likes it on the dry side together, and I can turn off the water to that section and turn it on as needed. But again, I think that comes with either a little bit of research or a little bit of failure. I learned by failing. That's the best way for me anyway. Elizabeth says, can you talk about some of the necessary elements one needs to make a bouquet besides the blooms? I want to up my bouquet game next year by planting some easily grown and interesting fillers. And I do think that's a really important element to make a bouquet look very interesting and very textural. And there's a lot of really neat things you can grow. And I also wrote down a list for this one. So the first one I have written down was a first for me last year. It's called Hibiscus Mahogany Splendor. I started it from seed inside, and it was the most beautiful seedling. Like, it looks like a Japanese maple, bright red, beautiful tray of seedlings in our plant room. I really enjoyed growing them. And then once I planted them out in the full sun, they just grew like crazy. But I had an issue with them. Every time I cut from the plant, they would wilt in the vase, like right away they would wilt. And so I was getting very discouraged. And then I learned that you're only supposed to cut from the woody part of the plant, not the fresh growth. And so that was one of my learning moments for last year. So I'm going to grow it again this year and experiment with it a little bit more because it's so interesting to look at. Other ones, Love in a Puff, also one I started from seed inside, and that was a vine that grew on the outer fence of our garden. Gorgeous. Like, that one I would recommend definitely growing. It creates these like lantern seed pods, but the leaf and vine itself is very elegant and very drapey and very it added so much movement to arrangements because I could stick it in the top and kind of like curve it around, or I could have it come out the bottom of the vase and curve around the base of the vase. It's just a really versatile vine. There's also peas, any kind of peas. You can do sweet peas or regular peas that you grow for actual food. The leaves and the blooms on those are beautiful, and even the peas, if you can have a few peas hanging out of your bouquet, that's really amazing. And then there's basil, which I grew 5 different types of last year. One of my favorite types, I grew cinnamon, which was awesome. The smell was amazing. And then there's a variety called cardinal that the blooms on it almost like they're kind of furry looking and they're red, just very interesting. And it adds some fragrance and some color and all that stuff. But it's also just very good for a leafy kind of accent. Of course, there's coleus, grasses are great, nasturtiums, not just for the blooms, but the leaves are really interesting, kind of lily pad looking. Heucheras, lamb's ear, dusty millers, lady's mantle. All of those are really amazing for leafy. Oh, and brunnera. Brunneras are awesome. And hostas. Shall I go on? Anything that has a leaf can be used as a foliage plant in an arrangement. Carly asked if there's any recommendations for shade. And of course, shade tolerant cut flowers are a little bit fewer and far between. There's some really beautiful options, but I think for the most part, cut flower gardens do best in a full sun location. And I think I attribute a lot of our success last year to the fact that our cut flower garden was right out in the middle of a pasture, and I got sun from morning until night without a break. I mean, they were never in the shade. They were always in full sun, and they just soaked it up, and they were able to produce because they had a lot of energy. But some of the things that are really good for shade are heucheras. You can use those for both leaves, and they shoot up the stalks with the really delicate looking bells, and I've used those a lot in arrangements. There is astilbes, which those produce some really interesting, like kind of almost like miniature pampas grass looking bloom stalks, and they come in different colors, red and white and pinks. Anemones, so Japanese anemones. There's a Fall in Love Sweetly. I've planted that one. I've got another older one. There's a white one. There's several options there that bloom later on in the season. Lily of the Valley, Solomon Seal, Bleeding Hearts are amazing. Of course, they're fairly short season on those. Hellebores are your winter flowers, so you can have some cutting for winter time. Northern Sea Oats is a grass that can handle quite a bit of shade, and it's really beautiful. It's one that I've got some in this garden. I've always had one in every space that I've been in, and they produce these beautiful drapey oat-shaped seeds that are just gorgeous in arrangements. And then of course Lady's Mantle is fairly shade tolerant as well. And it produces like chartreuse, stems with chartreuse green and yellow kind of blooms, and that one can be used for leaves too. Hannah says everything, the pros, cons, successes, failures, mistakes, what you would do differently, the cost, the profits, etc., etc. So that's a huge topic right there. The pros of having a cut flower garden space for me personally is that I have flowers at my disposal at any point during, most points during the growing season, to make arrangements to bring inside. I also gave a lot of bouquets away to friends and family. We did a free flower day downtown in our city and gave bouquets away there. And there's nothing quite like being able to do that. It's also beautiful to look at. I mean, it filled me with so much joy every single day. And I would say that that space made me the most happy last year of any part of my entire garden. It was so fun to watch that unfold. It provides a lot of hours of therapy. You can look at weeding and things like that as a therapeutic thing. Cons of it, depending on what you want to get from it, harvesting it does take up a lot of time. I mean, it takes up a lot of time, period. If you're wanting to do it on a bigger scale. If you're just tucking things into containers and raised beds, flower beds, totally doable, and I would recommend to start that way. If you're building it up into something bigger and you're wanting to do business, I can't speak to the profit part of this because I'm not doing it for profit. So I would probably lean on somebody like Floret Flower who's doing it, that's her business. So she could offer some more insight as far as that goes. But it's definitely something that you want to make sure you have time for, because you'd hate to put in all the effort of starting your seeds or sowing your seeds, excuse me, getting the space ready, and then letting it be taken over by weeds because, you know, you didn't allot yourself enough time. I think that you need to be realistic about it, which I'm actually going to do our cut flower garden space a tiny bit smaller this next year, knowing that, like, going forward, I thought like years down the road, and I thought, when I am older, am I going to want my cut flower garden to be massive? Or am I going to want it to be a manageable space where I can still dedicate more time to other spots in my garden too and enjoy other spots? So it's just some of those things that you have to think about. My biggest failures and mistakes from this past year, I can't really call it a mistake or a failure, but we started our planting very, very late in the season because we didn't have water in that space until mid to late June, I think it was. We just got started. I mean, the whole space was raw, and so we got started late because everybody was behind with everything last year, and I'm thankful we still went for it. And I remember Erin being like, I don't know, do you think all this work is worth it? Like, all that we're investing in this space and all the time and effort? And I kind of had that pit in my stomach thinking, I don't know if it's worth it. We'll see. And I was so thankful that it was as successful as it was, because by the end, I feel like we had both learned so much from that space, and we just saw some amazing things go down. So my biggest failure, though, would be putting non-water compatible things together. That would be it right there. And probably not staking my stuff early enough. Like, some of my things, like I mentioned earlier, Snapdragons, some of them were laying on the ground. I did have to stake corn up. It was not a cut flower issue. It was just my corn patch got totally blown over by the wind, and so I staked that whole thing up. And I hadn't really thought about that. And then my plant labeling system leaves a lot to be desired. I don't know why I choose like the smallest little labels and I put them in the ground, and it's great when there's just seeds in the ground, but when you've got a massive pumpkin or a huge dahlia, like sifting through the rows to find those tiny little stakes is not the way to do it. I got to figure out something better, something bigger, something that like really shows up. So plants labeling is something I need to up my game big time. Photo Prescott said it would be great to have a list of flowers for each month or two so there would be blooms all year round. Can you make one? And I do think that would make for a great, more detailed video later on. So first of all, knowing your flower's specific seasons is a really good idea. So there are certain flowers that do really well in the early spring months, like Bells of Ireland, Larkspur, sweet peas, Iceland poppies, honeywort, those types of things do really well early in the season. And then you've got your batch of things that do really well in the middle of summer and kind of come into their prime, like your celosia and basil and zinnias and snapdragons and boy, there's so many, cosmos and bachelor's buttons, all those types of things that are producing midsummer. And then you've got your things that come into their prime later on in the season, like Rudbekias, some late blooming sunflowers, a lot of the things that will grow in the summer will also produce into the fall as well. But knowing the specific growing seasons so that you can make sure to choose some of those things that will look good in each season is a really good idea. And then succession planting is also key. And that was one of the questions. I think Danny said, in a home garden, do you stagger plantings to have a continuous supply of flowers? Of cut flowers. And that is a good idea, especially for some varieties that don't, continue to produce. I think the most important piece of information with succession planting is knowing your average first frost date in the fall. So if you can figure that out, you can Google average first frost date and then your zip code, and it'll give you a date. And then depending on your flower crop, like let's say a sunspot sunflower, I think they have an 80-day maturity day. You need to be able to count back from that average date 80 days. If you don't have 80 days between that frost date and when you plant your seed, you probably won't see a bloom. But let's say you've got 110 days between when you're planting that seed and that average first frost date. You have enough time to get that seed in the ground and expect it to bloom by the end. And that was something I was kind of trying to impart when I did my late summer garden this last year and showed, I think, 10 different varieties that went in the ground. Everything produced flowers for the most part by our first frost date. And it was just merely by me looking at the seed packet, looking at the maturity date of that seed, and then counting back from that frost date and making sure that I had enough time. And many of those things that I grew, like the zinnias and cosmos and things, can be started early in the season as well. So you can have, every 2 weeks, if you plant a new crop, you can have flowers all the time. If you live in a warmer climate like I do, somewhere where it's hot and dry, you can typically get 3 to 4 different plantings of one type of flower that's a heat lover in one season. And then for those things that like more cool weather, you'd probably get like 2 to 3 out of those, because our cool season is much shorter than our hot season. So that's it, you guys, for today's video. I know it's not a very deep look into the subject of cut flower gardening, but I hope it was helpful enough to at least get your wheels turning and the conversation started. And I'm hoping this like late winter and into spring, we'll have time to sit down and go through these things in more detail. And of course, we're all learning here. I mean, I haven't been doing cut flower gardening in any sort of huge production way for very long, and I feel like every year we evolve, we get better. I listen to suggestions from other people and I implement those things, which sometimes helps me out big time. And those are all things that I think we can talk about and help each other out with. And today, right now, it is snowing really hard outside, and so it's just fun to be able to sit here and just talk about flowers. I mean, it's just kind of, it's making me feel like a little bit impatient because I'm already ready to get out there and plant. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video, and we will see you in the next one.